All right. Well, good afternoon again, everyone. I am Dr. Brandon McCormick, and I am the director of the Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice Research and also Associate Professor of Pan-African Studies and Comparative Humanities here at the University of Louisville. And we're very excited to be here this afternoon for this virtual Black History Month talk. And we could think of no better way to kick off Black History Month than with our speaker today. And I'll read his bio here momentarily, but we are so glad to have with us today Dr. Jarvis Givens from Harvard University, and his book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Dr. Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2021, could not be more timely for the kinds of conversations that we're having about education in this country right now. And so we wanted to have him here. I read his book and I was fascinated by it, and I reached out as soon as I got done reading it, and I said, how can we get him to talk to us at the Anne Braden Institute? And you know, when you have folks who are stellar scholars, and you go to their website, and then you have to go through, and you don't know if you're going to get a chance to talk to them or not. Maybe you're going to catch an agent, and maybe you have to go back and forth through the agent. But I reached directly out to him, and to my surprise, he responded back very quickly and said, hey, I would love to be able to give a talk at the University of Louisville at the ABI. And so I was very, very happy that we could get him here. We wanted to get him here in person, but we're still in the midst of the pandemic. And so we had to settle for virtual, but we are still really, really excited about him, about his book, and about this work on Dr. Carter G. Woodson, whom many of you will know as the founder of Black History Month, which was originally Negro History Week. And Dr. Givens' work just takes us into that history of Dr. Woodson's work and his decades-long effort to get Black history established as curriculum within the public school system and beyond, and in an era where it was not only illegal, but actions like that and interventions into curriculum were subject to acts of real violence by those who were determined to keep white supremacy as the status quo. And so as he takes this historical look back on the work of not only Dr. Woodson, but also legions of Black school teachers who were working alongside and with Dr. Woodson to do this work, it could not be more timely at a moment where teaching about race, teaching about Black studies, even the possibility of teaching Black history has come under assault by many legislators who are pushing to ban that type of education, as many of you know. And so we need to hear from scholars like Dr. Givens today. So we're very, very happy to have him here. But speaking of educators, we are also very happy to have a number of educators with us this afternoon. We have partnered with a few historically Black JCPS schools today, and we have invited them in particular, and we hope that there are teachers from all over JCPS and from other places as well. But we have as special guests with us today folks from the W.E.B. Du Bois Academy here in Louisville, from the Grace M. James Girls STEAM Academy, and also the historic Louisville Central High School today. And so welcome to all of you who are teachers and educators from those three schools, and all the rest of you educators who are out there from JCPS, but also here from the University of Louisville, to my colleagues in the Department of Pan-African Studies, and to all those other folks who are our allies in anti-racist teaching. Welcome to this virtual talk. Now let me read here this bio, and I will turn the floor over to Dr. Givens, because I want to have him to have his full time, and I want you all to have plenty of time to be able to engage him in a robust Q&A. All right, so Dr. Jarvis R. Givens is an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a faculty affiliate in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He specializes in the history of education, African American history, and theories of race and power in education. His first book, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, was published in 2021 by Harvard University Press, and he is currently building the Black Teacher Archive, an online portal which will house digitized records documenting the more than 100-year history of colored teachers associations. Professor Givens' research has been supported by fellowships and grants from the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, as well as the William F. Milton Fund. And Professor Givens earned his PhD in African American Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. And he is also a native of Compton, California, and currently resides in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Would you please join me in welcoming, either by a hand clap or an emoji clap, Dr. Jarvis Givens? Welcome to the Anne Braden Institute and the University of Louisville.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, for reaching out and for engaging the work. I was really appreciative of the email that you sent when you first reached out to kind of talk about the work. And when you shared about, the work that was taking place at the Anne Braden Institute, I felt like it was something that I wanted to be a part of. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity to address you all virtually, even though initially our conversations was about doing an in-person visit. But I'm excited to be here with you nonetheless. So the title of this talk today is The Fugitive Life of Black Teaching, A History of Pedagogy and Power. And I want to tell you first a little bit about the backstory in terms of how I came to this work and why, how the questions emerged for me that led to the book that I'm going to be talking about today. So I encountered a problem as a UC Berkeley doctoral student more than a decade ago at this point. And it altered the trajectory of my research on education, power, and Black life. A footnote about Carter G. Woodson's textbooks, published between 1922 and 1950, and their wide circulation among Black school teachers, posed a narrative problem. It challenged the impoverished framing of a history told and retold about African American schooling before Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and the rolling out of desegregation. The idea of African American school teachers writing textbooks about Black life and culture seemed to go against the grain of dominant narratives in public memory, and to be quite honest, a lot of academic scholarship on the subject as well. We were constantly inundated with iconic stories of separate and unequal, images of dilapidated Negro school buildings, and thorough documentation of white educational authorities' aggressive neglect of Black teachers and students. And to be clear, this history of violent educational inequity is an immutable fact. However, such institutional and ideological histories reveal only part of the story. They do much to document anti-Black persecution in American schooling, but very little to remember the role education played in Black spiritual strivings. They failed to account for the art of Black teaching, a legacy represented in those very textbooks published by Carter G. Woodson and then subversively taken up and put into practice by Black educators. And what I would come to learn is that those counter narratives in Black textbooks were only one piece of a more expansive plot against anti-Black protocols in the American school. And so, as an interdisciplinary historian trained in African American studies, my mission became very clear: to correct distortions about education and Black life by seeking out the voices of those who came before and heeding them by finding material evidence of their truths, to describe, with as much beauty and precision as I can, the complexity of Black educational realities, as well as the social forces that condition them. And then finally, to prescribe methods of pursuing educational justice informed by the weight of this history and the conceptual clarity that it offers. And so I hope that these kind of three tenets of my mission as a researcher trained in Black studies will come through in what I'll share today about the information I'll be sharing with you from my first book, Fugitive Pedagogy. And so to move to my more formal comments and the substance that I want to share today, I'm going to begin with the opening scenario of my book. Tessie McGee read to her class in a steady, measured tone, quietly engaging in a calculated act of subversion. She was Black, 28 years old, and she taught history in 1933 at the only Black secondary school in Webster Parish, Louisiana. The all-whites Department of Education and local school board gave clear instructions. Teachers were to keep the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, which they were to follow closely to assure that their students became acquainted with the targeted learning objectives. Black educators and families in Webster Parish had little formal control over curriculum. Yet on many occasions, McGee made what she deemed to be necessary revisions to the mandatory curriculum. Based on her own judgment, and perhaps at the recommendation of fellow Black teachers, she often read passages from Carter G. Woodson's book on the Negro, which rested comfortably in her lap. She kept the textbook out of sight, understanding that if she were to be caught, she would be vulnerable to the disciplinary practices of Jim Crow authorities. But she was undeterred. One of Miss McGee's students from that year will recount, quote, "She read to us from that book, and when the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk, and she began teaching us from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap." Tessie McGee's method of instruction constitutes a textbook example of what I am calling fugitive pedagogy. Fugitive pedagogy consists of African Americans' physical and intellectual acts that explicitly challenged anti-Black protocols of educational domination, actions that often took place in discreet or partially concealed fashion. And I think it's important to note where I'm drawing this language of fugitivity and Black fugitive life from. My use of this term fugitive draws inspiration from the literary scholars Stephen Best and Saidiya Hartman's discussion of what they call fugitive justice, where they introduce the idea of, quote, two competing narratives of the fugitive's identity. And they're particularly writing and referring to the history of fugitive slaves. Fugitive connotes the dual image of one who escapes enslavement or jailed confinement, which justifies his capture, even death, at the hand of law enforcement. Yet, as Best and Hartman explain, the violence of enslavement and legal capture engenders as well a countervailing narrative of and by the fugitive as victim of anti-Black domination. And we find parallel, equally competing historical images when adapting this concept to American education. The dominant story of the nation's past had long vilified, devalued, and disrespected Black people, thereby justifying their persecution in various forms, including enslavement, disenfranchisement, and imprisonment. This violent reality and the hypocrisy it exposed about the nation prompted a counter-historical narrative and way of knowing. Indeed, one represented in the very extensive factual evidence contained in Carter G. Woodson's textbooks. Wearing the mask, as the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar called it, had long been part and parcel of Black teachers' professional disposition. Tessie McGee's concealed lesson plan rejected the degrading representations of Black life in official school curricula, and such refusal manifested in physical form. McGee's public display of the official outline was in fact a masked performance of complicity, an embodied text that accompanied the subversive and spoken content of her lesson. McGee's physical act of switching text also communicated important lessons to her students, demonstrating how defiance could at times be disguised by public performances of deference to the coercive regime of school authorities. And so now, building with this scenario, I want to take the remainder of my time to look closely at three aspects of this story that I just shared: the teachers, the textbooks, and the students. I'll offer a closer reading of teachers like Tessie McGee and their efforts to disrupt anti-Black protocols in education, and then how Woodson's textbooks built on an expansive intellectual tradition in the heritage of Black education. And finally, I want to focus on the students who bore witness to their teachers' fugitive practice, leaving a record of it to be studied in the future. The teachers. Teachers like Tessie McGee gained access to alternative scripts of knowledge through what the sociologist Alden Morris has called insurgent intellectual networks. These were institutions like Carter G. Woodson's Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which he founded in 1915 while working as a school teacher, but also organizations like Black Teacher Associations. Such organizations comprised a veiled yet networked Black educational world, one where African Americans said one thing but often did another. Given rampant anti-Black violence, the true political intentions undergirding Black teaching were rarely on full display. African Americans responded, often in quiet, calculated acts of resistance against oppressive school settings that reflected a world order built on their subjection. And fugitive pedagogy was a collective endeavor, even when manifesting as these individual acts of practice, like in the case of Tessie McGee. For instance, the principal entering McGee's classroom was a Black man named J.L. Jones. And record suggests that Jones supported the inclusion of Black history and culture at Webster Parish. We know that he was a leading member in the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association, which had explicitly endorsed Carter G. Woodson and his work by the 1930s. And we know from the historical record that Woodson regularly appeared in states like Louisiana and across the South, including states like Kentucky, Tennessee, as you see from this image on the screen, at the state and national Black Teacher Association meetings, where he often appeared as a keynote speaker or as an active member, as you see Woodson's life membership card in the National Black Teacher Association. So given this context, it is not implausible to consider that Principal Jones and Miss McGee may have very likely conspired together, the principal testing the teacher to ensure she could protect herself and the school if a white official entered the room. The intrusion of white surveillance had a hand in shaping the school's ecology. It was not atypical for white people to drop by unannounced during the school day, either to show off their Negro school, as some of them put it, to visitors, or for routine inspections. Such visits were primarily meant to demonstrate power, which was essential to reproducing domination. So this is all to say, the person walking into Miss McGee's classroom could just as easily have been a white school official. Black teachers walked a tightrope when challenging such oppressive schooling contexts, because if they were to fall or be caught, there was no safety net to catch them. For example, just a few years prior, the white school board in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which was heavily influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, learned that Carter G. Woodson's textbooks were being used in the local Black high school. The books were confiscated, teachers were reprimanded, and the principal was threatened and forced to resign. And then after reading the textbooks, the school board, quote, expressed horror and surprise that such a work should have crept into our Negro schools, end quote. They went on to assure their white constituents that they would be more vigilant moving forward, stating, quote, we must not take in teachers who will create discord by teaching isms of any sort, end quote. And this kind of violent oversight is plentiful, and it moves forward and backwards in time as far as Black teachers are concerned. Black educators were routinely targeted and fired for challenging white authority. Notable examples of this being Ida B. Wells, who was fired as a teacher in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1890s, John W. Davison, who was fired just after the 20th century in Georgia, and not for teaching African-American history, but for teaching Latin, when white funders insisting on an industrial model of education found teaching Latin to be beyond the bounds of what should constitute Black education, right? But then also Anna Julia Cooper, fired and demoted around the same time from the M Street School in Washington, D.C., and of course the iconic narrative of Septima Clark, who was fired in South Carolina. And yet, there were some Black teachers who lost more than their jobs. Harry and Harriet Moore were fired in 1946 and later killed when their home was bombed in Mims, Florida. Black teachers' awareness of such stories prompted them, at times, to conceal their pedagogical objectives in the presence of intrusive white power. Subjection to surveillance and violence, motivated by no causal logic whatsoever, was a fact of Blackness. African American educators developed strategies to contest this reality, which ranged from things they did from building institutions down to things that they did at the interpersonal and psychic levels in the private spaces of their classrooms. So fugitivity, in its historical reference, holds in place the realities of constraint and African Americans' constant straining against said confinement. The language is careful not to overstate one or the other. As Fred Moten aptly notes, escape is an activity, not an achievement. The possible threat of recapture always lingered. Escape was unresolved and uncertain, and Black teachers carried intimate knowledge of such precarity. So now the textbooks. As previously mentioned at the start of the talk, I shared that my concerns with the historical framings of Black education actually began with the textbook. When I come across a passing reference to Woodson's textbooks, one of which you see on the screen being read by a group of junior high students in New Orleans during the 1930s. I was aware that Woodson played a central role in African American studies as the second Black person to get a PhD from Harvard in 1912, and as founder of Negro History Week, which of course we now celebrate today as Black History Month. But I was shocked to learn about the size of Woodson's impact on educational practice during Jim Crow in the private spaces of Black educators' classrooms. While most accounts emphasize Woodson's role as a historian, affectionately referring to him as the father of Black history, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, much less have been written about Woodson's near 30-year career as a public school teacher. And what intrigued me most about Woodson's textbooks, as well as those written by Black educators well before him, was their extensive commemoration of fugitive slaves and Black fugitive life. As early as 1890, Black school teachers wrote textbooks filled with heroic narratives about enslaved Blacks who absconded from plantations, those who led slave revolts, stories of Black maroon communities in the dismal swamps of Virginia, Suriname, Brazil, and Jamaica. And that's not all. The fugitive slave emerged as a folk hero, what we might think of as a cultural symbol in the curricula developed by these educators. The fugitive slave also appeared in school naming practices and commemorative ceremonies in school activities. It was this observation that initially prompted my reliance on the fugitive slave archetype and on fugitive pedagogy as a theory and practice of Black educational life in the United States. So what I'm saying here is that the term that I'm offering in fugitive pedagogy is much, much more than just some elaborate metaphor, but it names a phenomenon that surfaced in the archival record at multiple levels. And what's more, the concept is drawing a narrative line from those enslaved Black peoples who defied anti-literacy laws during slavery, which criminalized Black education, right? The language is saying there's a political relationship between that political history and education and what came in the post-emancipation period, where we see teachers like Tessie McGee continuing to engage in these subversive underground practices of education. And it was clarifying to learn that the very first Black authored textbooks were written by fugitive slaves. James W.C. Pennington, an escaped slave from Maryland, inaugurated this tradition in 1841. A textbook on the origins and history of the colored people represents the beginning of a formalized practice of Black people striving to rewrite the system of knowledge. The fugitive slave William Wells Brown also wrote a textbook in 1863. So as the 19th century witnessed the proliferation of Black newspapers, Black journals, and various other forms of Black print culture, textbooks became tools, not only of the masters, but also of the fugitive slave. And such counter readings of the world would carry over to Woodson's theorizing about Black education in the post-emancipation era. In his iconic text, published in 1933, The Miseducation of the Negro, Woodson wrote, quote, "Starting out after the Civil War, the opponents of freedom and social justice decided to work out a program which would enslave the Negro's mind inasmuch as the freedom of body had to be conceded," end quote. Woodson suggests that the political conflicts at the core of Black education were fundamentally linked to the legacies and social technologies of enslavement. And in his first textbook, The Negro in Our History, Woodson offered the following: "How some of these slaves learned in spite of opposition makes a beautiful story. Knowing the value of learning as a means of escape and having longing for it too because it was forbidden, many slaves continued their education under adverse circumstances." So here we see Woodson naming this entanglement of violent white opposition and the enslaved people's steady practice of, quote, "learning as a means of escape" as a generative lesson for Black teachers and students during Jim Crow. Indeed, this was the origin story that framed what was politically at stake in their teaching and learning. At its highest calling, Black education continued to be a stealing away from and refusal of the American school's official protocols and curricula. And so now I just want to take a brief second to tell you about the official textbooks and the official curriculum that Tessie McGee was technically required to teach from. We're able to learn, by going to the public school records in Louisiana to see what the adopted textbooks were by the 1930s. And then I was able to kind of go and actually look at the content of those textbooks. And I'm going to give just one example from the 10th grade textbook to demonstrate the kind of distortions of Black life that would have appeared in this required curriculum that Tessie McGee was supposed to be teaching from. In the first chapter of Modern Times and the Living Past by Henry Elson, the author writes the following, quote, "Not only are almost all the civilized nations of today of the white race, but throughout all the historic ages, this race has taken the lead and has been foremost in the world's progress." He then goes on to explain that, quote, "Almost the entire book will be devoted to the doings of the Caucasian race, or more specifically, at least 9/10 of the book must be given to an account of the Indo-European branch of the race, as the Indo-Europeans have dominated the world for the past 2,500 years, end quote. So based on Louisiana's adopted curriculum, Tessie McGee and her students were narratively condemned, to borrow from the Black studies scholar Sylvia Winter. It deemed them to be of no human concern. And so while we are unaware of the exact passage Tessie McGee may have been reading from Carter G. Woodson's textbook in that scenario I recalled earlier, we at least know what she was negating. And Carter G. Woodson worked fervently from his office at 1538 9th Street Northwest in the historic Shaw District in Washington, D.C. Woodson lived, worked, and died in this building. And it's from this post that Woodson responded personally to letters written by individual teachers, some writing him with historical questions, others inquiring in hushed tones about how they might strategically work to challenge curriculum standards on a local level. Woodson and his very small staff mailed textbooks to individual teachers across the country. They packaged Negro history kits by hand, and they shipped off decorative materials for teachers to refashion their classrooms. And interestingly enough, Woodson's educational program expanded most dramatically during the Depression years, because after developing an unfavorable reputation among white philanthropists, by 1930, Woodson would come to rely on the Black masses to support his Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And it's important that we observe that Black teachers were at the forefront of that cause. Woodson would charge that the reconstitution of knowledge was a critical step in challenging violent assaults against Black humanity. He professed there would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom. Woodson often named this schoolroom lynching duality because it highlighted what was fundamentally at stake. Education was not just about vocational trades, developing more African-American professionals, or bourgeois performances of citizenship. It was about insisting on Black social and political life as opposed to death. It meant making legible the social disfiguring of Black humanity that whiteness demands for its propping up, then refusing it through counter readings of both the word and world. Pending radical reformation of the American school, Woodson urged educators to perform bold acts of defiance. And so now I want to turn our attention to the students. Black students were always watching. To elevate the significance of Tessie McGee's Fugitive Pedagogy, I want to invert the scenario and draw your attention to the student as witness. The 16-year-old Jerry Moore, who took note of Miss McGee as she removed her mask of compliance, documenting how, quote, her eyes went back to the book in her lap, end quote. In recounting this one gesture by his teacher, Jerry Moore revealed how what was seen, heard, and felt in Black classrooms all affected what students learned. Education extended far beyond what was uttered or written. They learned from the value systems that shaped school routines and the actions of their teachers. All the while, students were watching them, witnessing. First-person accounts by Black students have become central to my thinking on African-American educators. Their chorus of voices expand the historical record in critical ways, providing some of the most reliable sources of what Black teachers actually did beyond the watchful eyes of white surveillance. Student narratives found in autobiographical literature and archival materials helped me trace Woodson's partnership with African-American educators on a national level. But this vast repository of knowledge, I want to say just briefly, has much more to offer than just the stories I write about in Fugitive Pedagogy. Therefore, I built my second monograph around the voices of Black students. School Clothes, a collective memoir of Black student witness, which is forthcoming with Beacon Press, explores what it has meant to be a Black student in the American school. It relies on more than 100 student narratives across the 19th and 20th centuries to explore key themes in the history of Black education. Debates about intelligence, conflicts between education and racial capitalism, desegregation, literacy, political activism, and more. For so long, Black students have been written about and held under a microscope, picked and prodded as specimen for study. They have long been held in prolonged gaze, and rarely have those gazing felt the risk of Black students looking back. But Black students have always been watching and speaking and writing and singing, striving to give an account of themselves and the entangled relations structuring their social worlds. We find Black students insisting that they have always been more than mere objects of history, but instead its subjects. Like Angela Davis, born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944. The scholar and activist would recall that Woodson's Negro History Week was, quote, the highlight of our year, end quote. During these commemorative weeks, teachers instructed students to, quote, slam shut and cast aside their books that did their best to persuade us that our ancestors were much better off during slavery than they would have been had they remained in Africa, end quote. Davis and her schoolmates were then allowed to, quote, rely on our own ability to produce knowledge about the conditions surrounding our lives, end quote. Students engaged in a collective critique of the normative white curriculum in their casting it aside. More than just a captive audience, Black students were active participants, dissident learners participating in a tradition of fugitive pedagogy. Davis recalled encountering a photo of Harriet Tubman, and she states nostalgically, quote, "I remember, I always visualized Harriet Tubman as my grandmother. I thought my grandmother bore this striking resemblance to her, and that remains with me to this day," end quote. Tubman's picture inspired Davis not only because it shared some likeness with her grandmother, but also because of the scripts accompanying the image of this fugitive slave. According to Davis, her teachers always emphasized that, quote, "Harriet Tubman helped more slaves to gain their freedom than any of those other conductors on the Underground Railroad," end quote. And when writing about her student experiences in Birmingham, Davis also bore witness to the vulnerability of her Black teachers. She would describe belittling actions of white visitors and school authorities, writing, quote, "When these white assaults were staged, I tried to decipher the emotions on the teacher's face. Acquiescence, defiance, or the pain of realizing that if she did fight back, she would surely lose her job," end quote. Undergirding these experiences recalled by students was a shared vulnerability between educators and Black students. And Davis gives language to this when recalling the racialized violence in Birmingham during her childhood. She recalled the sounds of bombs exploding across the street from her home, as well as her mother having been one of the teachers to a young girl killed in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church. Such events reflect the perpetual threat students, teachers, and communities had to reckon with, both in and outside of the classroom. The shared vulnerability of Black teachers and students prompted shared action. Jerry Moore recognized this in Miss McGee's classroom as her lesson plan switched with the turning of a doorknob. Angela Davis recounted the intellectual partnership between students and teachers as they engaged in a shared critique of the American curriculum. And such moments hinged on a fugitive reading practice of the known world. Congressman John Lewis offered a similar narrative when recalling, quote, "the unbelievable teachers in Troy, Alabama," end quote. Lewis would go on to explain, "When I was a little child growing up in rural Alabama, a short walk to the cotton fields, my teachers would tell us to cut out photographs and pictures of great African Americans for Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week." Lewis would also explain that it was these same teachers that would discreetly inform students about the civil rights protests and boycotts taking place in cities like Montgomery, just miles away. And this transcript of Black students bearing witness to fugitive pedagogy goes far and wide. In 1929, a student at the National Training School for Women and Girls explained the following in her yearbook: "This school teaches history and Negro history, and the students are tremendously inspired by learning the truth about their own race. Dr. Carter G. Woodson's books are used as the text here, and we have a room, a real library, if you please, set apart for the study of Negro life and history," end quote. And then a few pages later, the training school students went on to celebrate one of their peers, a student by the name of Catherine Allen, for being outspoken against matters of racial injustice. Having been inspired by their lessons in Negro history, Allen became a race agitator, as her peers called it. In fact, quote, "Many race agitators have been discovered, and Miss Allen, a senior, is sure to become another Sojourner Truth," end quote. Here we see the students celebrating the young activist in the making, and again, the fugitive slave reappears as a folk hero, Sojourner Truth having been featured as her own superlative category. For students like Angela Davis, John Lewis, and the training school girls, their teachers' fugitive pedagogy allowed them to situate themselves in a continuum of consciousness. They were taught to aspire to be part of a tradition of Black people who disrupted an anti-Black social order. These scenarios that I've just shared, which are scattered across time and place, were not sporadic, unplanned events or mere infrapolitics. They reflect coordinated efforts on the part of Black educators. And fugitive pedagogy in the classroom was a dress rehearsal. Students' participation in the subversive politics of Black education anticipated and prefigured their active involvement in the civil rights and Black power movements on the horizon. Not to mention their demands for Black studies in American colleges and universities. And this legacy can be traced through the lives of many prominent Black scholars. And I'll just give one example. St. Clair Drake, anthropologist and flagship hire for the Black Studies program at Stanford University in 1969. And this is just one of many examples that we can give of these examples of students educated in these contexts who wrote about these early educational experiences informing their orientation to what would become Black studies, right? So Drake shared the following about his education at the Booker T. Washington School in Stoughton, Virginia. He offered, "They had good teachers who were highly motivated. During the summer, many of these teachers pursued their studies in the North, and they brought back ideas they scavenged from writers of the Harlem Renaissance. They did Negro History Week once a year, and for the first time, I was introduced to Afro-American culture." Drake will compare his segregated education in Virginia with his prior experiences in Pennsylvania, explaining, quote, "These things I had never heard of in my Pittsburgh integrated school situation," end quote. Drake would go on to participate in student protests during his freshman year at Hampton Institute in fall 1927. He and his classmates presented a list of more than 60 demands, including demands for more Black teachers and administrators. Drake would also be the chair of a student-run branch of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History at Hampton. So what I'm saying here is that the traditions that passed through African-American school teachers were intimately tied to the intellectual work taken up in the 1960s and 70s. These educators shaped generations of Black thinkers who would go on to establish the first protocols of what we now know to be Black studies, Pan-African studies, African-American studies, and Africana studies. Resistance was omnipresent in Black segregated classrooms. Contrary to popular assumptions, Black teachers promoted that resistance in the minds of their students, and it built up over time and culminated in the modern freedom struggle. Their pedagogy was like a river, and it moved through the lives of their students. It ebbed and flowed, took unexpected turns, but always continued in the direction of a new world. The educators called upon in my book are portals into a heritage of fugitive pedagogy. They represent a tradition that has been plundered from today's Black educators who are its rightful inheritors, and yet all who are committed to critical pedagogy or anti-racist teaching, as the term has recently become popularized, might draw inspiration from their legacy. I see the cast of characters in my book as standard bearers. Their heritage is one worthy of both praise and deep study. And I'm going to end my comments there for today, and want to kind of invite Brandon to come back and join me for us to have a conversation, but also to invite any questions that you all might have about anything that I've shared, anything that I might have shared and glossed over in the presentation. But at this point, I just want to thank you for your attention, and looking forward to engaging in dialogue about how this work is relevant for today, but also questions about more about what I share, because this is such a rich history that is worth sitting and thinking about and kind of tinkering with, right? To do more, to tell the stories of these teachers and the lessons that we can learn from what they did, right? So thank you for that. And I want to invite again, Professor McCormick to join me as we transition to the next part of today's program. Thanks.
So I hope I saw some clapping emojis already among the participants, and I hope the rest of you will join me in really in a moment of appreciation for what Dr. Jarvis Givens has just offered us in this rich talk that has really traced out not just the work of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, but also as he talks about the work of these teachers, the work of the textbook, and the work of the students, and what a wonderful way to frame that conversation to give us the insight into this history of anti-racist teaching. As I was talking beforehand with him, I said, there's so many things, having read the book and having read a couple of articles that you've written about this, that I would love to just sit and talk with you and chop up all kinds of things about this tradition of Black education. You see, I've worn my Black Educator t-shirt today that I got from a sister in Philly who runs a shop called Incense Trap and Yoga, right? So if you Black educators need your Black Educator t-shirt, be sure to hit that site up. But I don't want to dominate the conversation as a moderator. And so there are questions that I may save to the end to ask, but I really want our guests to be able to engage in conversation and to ask as many questions as they want to. And so if you can use the emoji, the hand raise emoji, and or put questions in the chat, I will try to, Demi and I, who is our program coordinator, will try to get to as many questions as we can, because we still have nearly 45 minutes to engage Dr. Givens. So if there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and or use the hand raise emoji, and we will try to locate you. There's nearly 100 people on here, so we got to scroll through to find your hand, but we will find you. We have a couple of questions here, one from Tanika Irvin and one from Professor David Anderson. And Tanika Irvin asks, was Carter G. Woodson a proponent of school integration?
So it's an interesting thing. So Woodson, in some ways, Woodson would never advocate for, separate education, kind of like on a whole, right? Recognizing the violence of de jure segregation, right? But at the same time, I think what Woodson often said in writing is that debates about desegregation or integration in many ways can miss more fundamental questions about what is the foundation of the education we're trying to offer to students, right? Because whether you're offering Black students an education that's deeply violent and that distorts, their experiences, or that completely allies their experiences altogether, right, in an all Black setting or in an integrated setting, Woodson would say that it's continuing to do and reproduce the same kind of harm, right? So I think these are similar kind of questions that we see Du Bois grappling with in his classic essay, "Does the Negro Need Separate Schools?" which he writes about, which he publishes in 1935. And so, Woodson would absolutely condemned Jim Crow schooling, right, and the violence of segregated schooling. But at the same time, Woodson was also invested in thinking about, the importance of role that Black teachers could and needed to play in thinking about the liberation of Black people, right? So Black folks, even those that advocated for desegregation, advocated for a much more expansive vision of desegregation or integration than what was rolled out, right? And what was imagined by those folks who had the influence to shape the policy of how Brown versus the Board of Education was interpreted and executed. And so I think that this was one of those things where it becomes kind of complicated. But one thing that I do know is that given the kinds of critiques that Woodson raised about schooling, the kinds of emphasis that Woodson had on the need for Black teachers to teach Black students, right? He would not have been an ideal expert witness to bring on the courts, to bring into the courtroom. Neither would Du Bois, right? Would not have been an expert witness to kind of bring and share their views, even though they were very important scholars thinking about Black education during that time period. Because in many ways, what they would argue would conflict with some of the litigation strategies that were being used to make the case for Brown when we think about the kind of court cases leading up to the Brown v. Board decision. right? So I would say that it's not a kind of a straight yes or no sort of answer, is that Woodson was always advocating for a more liberatory model of education, right? But he also had concerns about whether or not, you know, the same white educators and educational leaders that were currently working to undermine Black teachers could be trusted to roll out a desegregation process that honored the intentions of what it was that Black folks in the freedom movement were actually pushing for, right? So we see this kind of delicate dance happening among Woodson, but also among other important Black thinkers as well, like folks like W.B. Du Bois, but also folks we think about like Zora Neale Hurston, right, where these complicated questions come up around desegregation.
Right. Thanks. I'm gonna try. They're now at. People took a moment, right, and they started typing, and they're all in the chat. So let me go through a few of these and see how many of these we can get to. Professor David Anderson over in English asked, I had a question about the training of Saturday academies teaching African American history, such as here in Louisville, Blaine Hudson, and in St. Louis in the 1920s and 30s. Herman Dreer and Julia Davis. Did Woodson have a role in these? And here in Louisville, Saturday Academy, of course, our own Dr. J. Blaine Hudson would just teach out in the community, right? Free of service, just teach Black history to the community. He saw it as part of his vocation, his calling. This was uncompensated work, but just felt like Black history needed to be taught to the public. And so he would just go out in the midst of the community, in a community center and other sites, and just teach the people. And so I guess the question from Professor Anderson is whether or not Woodson had some role in shaping efforts like that.
So what I would say is that you know, it's possible, but one of the things that I always try to emphasize is that many of the practices that became institutionalized through Woodson's organization and his work as a leader of ASALH and all the organizations that he helped create, many of those practices that became institutionalized were things that many Black teachers had been doing in pockets in various different places. So I try to, when I was writing the book, but also when I engage in these talks, I try to be clear. I don't want to kind of position Woodson as like this third fountainhead of knowledge in the Du Bois, Washington, you know, kind of figureheads of Black education, right? Because these kind of rank and file Black teachers in many ways did a lot of important work organizing this stuff, you know, before Woodson found his organization in 1915. So it's very possible that those practices may have existed in a place like, you know, in Kentucky and in Louisville before Woodson. That being said, I can recall a Negro History Week circular in the 1930s that has a photograph of a local educator who was also a poet. I'm remembering his last name is Potter. His first name will come to me eventually, but it was an older man by the name of Potter who was also an educator in Louisville, and it was an image of him with these young students about these kind of playground Black History Month lessons that he would offer in the community, right? That was profiled in this Negro History Week circular that Woodson circulated in the 1930s. So it's very possible that there is this tie between these Saturday schools and these out-of-school learning spaces that were created in places like Louisville, but also other places. I can think of Nathan Willis, who was one of the first Black secondary school history teacher in the New York public school, who was a member of ASALH and who would teach these Black History Month, these Black History classes on Saturdays and Sundays in Harlem, right? And people that, you know, frequented these spaces, folks like, you know, John Henrik Clarke talked about that weekend's Black History School being very pivotal in his own development when he migrates and goes to Harlem. But also we find someone like Kwame Nkrumah, who's a student in the US at the time, also coming and attending these weekend classes by this Black high school teacher in New York, who's the local chair and president of the branch of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in New York. So I'm saying that to say, absolutely, there is this kind of networked world that Black teachers are a part of. And Woodson is a central figure when it comes to the organizing around Black life and culture. And it's a tradition that starts before him, but it's one that he picks up and expands on and institutionalizes and formalizes in these very important ways with things like Negro History Week, the Negro History Bulletin, which is a magazine that's circulated among teachers. And then I see this question about how did Black teachers organize, you know, prior to social media and things like that. And that's an important part of this story, I seen someone ask that in the chat. These colored teacher associations were key to creating these kind of networks where you have these exchange of ideas, where teachers are getting access to information that they wouldn't have had available to them in traditional teacher training pathways, right? So if you have teachers that are going through traditional teacher training pathways, whether they're at HBCUs or not, right? In these intellectual spaces, they're able to bring in people like Du Bois or Mary McLeod Bethune or Carter G. Woodson to provide important scholarship for them to think with as they're trying to develop a meaningful educational agenda, right? Where they're blending the best thinking among mainstream white educational thinkers, but they're also building with the ideas from the Black intellectual elite who may or may not have been able to teach at the university level, right? And so those Black teacher association spaces were very important. And those are institutions that, for the most part, were gutted when they were forced to integrate themselves out of existence in the 1960s with the rolling out of desegregation. And we have yet to fully appreciate what was lost with that important advocacy base that worked for the professionalization of Black teachers, but also for developing a robust educational agenda that centered the needs of Black students, right? That where we see Black teachers engaging in this important kind of intellectual struggle around these questions.
All right, these are all rich answers. Let me navigate some of these questions and to keep us in this kind of historical moment, and then get to some of the more contemporary questions about the parallels between what's going on right now. Shas Ray McCormick, a teacher at Grace James Academy, who also happens to be my spouse, asked, can you please share some information about Layla A. Pendleton? We rarely hear about Black women who started these traditions early on.
Yes, so Lila Amos Pendleton was a teacher in Washington, D.C. And in my book, one of the chapter where I'm talking about Woodson's textbooks, one of the things that I found it to be important to do was to talk about Black teachers who published textbooks before Woodson, right? So Lila Amos Pendleton was one of those teachers who published a textbook in 1912 called A Narrative of the Negro, which we see featured as a recommended reading in the Crisis magazine from 1912 up until the early 1920s, right? And then after that point, Woodson's textbook, which is much more expansive, starts to become the more popular textbook that we see appearing in these kind of forms. But Lila Amos Pendleton, she was very involved in a number of different Black organizations, including Woodson's, ASNLH when he founds it, because they're both teachers in Washington, D.C. And the reason that I lift up Lila Amos Pendleton's narrative is because it demonstrates the kind of intellectual culture among Black teachers, right, that Woodson would have benefited from before he built his organization in 1915, right? Many people think about Woodson going and founding the ASNLH in Chicago over the summer, but what we see in the public school records is that the Black teachers in 1915 in DC public schools, where Lila Amos Pendleton was a teacher, where Woodson was a teacher, where Anna Julia Cooper was a teacher, they have been organizing to figure out how they could integrate more about Black life and culture into the curriculum. And there was a formal report submitted to the school district months before Woodson would found his organization, right? So I situate Woodson in this world of Black teachers, the majority of whom were Black women like Lila Amos Pendleton, but it's a legacy that goes back even before her, right? We can think about Edward Johnson in 1890, who wrote a textbook as a school principal in North Carolina. And before that, someone like Charlotte Fortin, she's born and from a free Black family during the antebellum era in Philadelphia. And then she goes to school in an integrated school in Massachusetts. And she talks about how alienated she felt as a Black student, even among this integrated school in the antebellum period. But she would then go to become a teacher during the Civil War in the South Carolina Sea Islands. And she talks about, and we can read in her diaries when she's talking about why she's teaching these recently emancipated Black students about Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution. She says, because these students need to know what one of their own color had done for his race, right? So we see Charlotte Fortin as a teacher raising these curricular questions, even as she's teaching, recently emancipated Black students as the Civil War is, just moving towards a close, but raising these very important fundamental questions about content and about, what are the larger political and intellectual tasks that Black education needs to be working through, and how do teachers prioritize that in their practice?
Yeah, okay. And then we have from one of our students in Pan-African Studies, Savannah Winston. She asked, of course, the million-dollar question: what are some parallels you see between the fight against fugitive pedagogy during the 20th century versus the fight against critical race theory today?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think one of the things that the parallels that I see is that what we see happening right now is much more consistent with the longer span of American history when it comes to policing and surveilling knowledge and education. I think a lot of folks might have gotten a little comfortable within the recent years and recent decade with a lot of the DEI initiatives, a lot of the kind of efforts around inclusion and belonging, right? To where, we have to remember it wasn't, that's a fairly short amount of time where we saw a lot of these kind of efforts happening in the public sphere, even though it was unequally distributed across places and across regions. That was the case, right? But even that short window, right, where folks might be considering this, wondering like, how is it that we're going from that to these legislative bills to try to ban and restrict all of that work? And it's like, well, actually, what we see happening now is much more consistent with the longer time span of the politics of knowledge and surveillance in the context of the U.S., right? It's, and it's important for us to put that in a longer context. Toni Morrison has a quote when she's talking in 1992 where she says, "Nothing is so fought over than our approach to knowledge and its parameters," right? Nothing is so fought over than our approach to knowledge and its parameters. And so there's a universal reality around, negotiating and debating about what constitutes legitimate knowledge, right? What kind of knowledge should be prioritized and privileged in the context of schools, right? And whose perspectives should knowledge be written from, and whose perspective should be privileged in the knowledge that we take seriously and that we teach and that we expect students to learn from, right? And that's something that's a US problem, right, that we're dealing with, but that's something that becomes consistent when we think about fundamental questions about education and power, even beyond the US context, right? This has to do when we think about the history of, apartheid in South Africa, right? Or if we think about questions around language, what language can and cannot be taught when we think about the history of indigenous education in the US, right? Educational content and the parameters of knowledge are always something that have been policed by those in power, right? Because ultimately formal education has been understood as something that's supposed to serve the interests of the nation, right? And obviously we know there are competing interests in terms of what meaningful education should and can look like when we think about the experiences of Black people versus white parents and white students in Florida who feel that certain knowledge might cause discomfort and should not be privileged as education in those schools, right? As though learning about slavery is comfortable for Black students, right? Or as if learning about the, dispossession of native land is comfortable for indigenous students, right? This has to do with the relationship between power and how that's negotiated when it comes to formal established ideas around what constitutes knowledge, legitimate knowledge that should be prioritized when it comes to education. And that has a very long history, and the history of Black teachers, is one of the most representative cases that we have to look to study these questions in the US.
Thank you. So you, at the end there, you were talking about, the notion of this teaching being uncomfortable, and that speaks to Greg Tishner's question of we're seeing a lot of pushback about white students feeling uncomfortable about real history. How would you suggest a 7th grade teacher best address that? And so if you want to speak a little bit more about that, you can, but let me roll that into the question from our principal at Central High School, Tamla Compton, who says, how do you see this work impacting teacher training programs? Currently, only 7% of teachers in Kentucky are Black or brown. How do we prepare teachers to be conduits of this work? So taking that together, perhaps with some of this conversation about white students feeling uncomfortable and their parents. So how do we train for this work?
Yeah, I think that, in Souls of Black Folk, there is, I'm trying to think, the chapter of Souls of Black Folk, it's the fiction narrative on the coming of John. When it's a Black student from rural Georgia, he goes, gets an education, and then he comes back. There's a question when his sister asks him, does it hurt to learn? And it's a kind of left as an open question in that particular text. But I think that that's generative for, for thinking about what knowledge is supposed to do when we think about the developmental needs of students and of the mind, right? There should be some level when we're engaging in kind of our own learning about ourselves, learning about the social world around us and how we're situated within it. There's going to be some discomfort that comes with that, right? So the thing is that I think we have to be clear about that, right? What we're at is a moment where we're saying that for so long, Black students and marginalized students who come from marginalized communities have always had to experience discomfort when it comes to encountering the realities of history that they can't escape, that they can't ignore, right? That they have to attend to because of their family lineages, their own family histories, and the things that they see around them. We're at a place where we're having these debates where some folks are pushing and saying this discomfort is something that actually needs to be shared across racial groups and across student groups. And you have folks pushing back and saying, no, like white students should not have to encounter this complicated history because it makes them feel uncomfortable about their identity as white students, right? And as though it feels good for Black students to be, that narrative also relies on this idea that Black students are only positioned in this story as victims, right? And so I think that we have to talk openly about the meaning of education and the kind of discomfort that naturally comes with learning and growing and stretching one's mind and one's imagination. And also the kind of discomfort that comes with encountering the world that structures our reality. And that's something that we are constantly going to have to negotiate and think about that, right? And it's the responsibility of teachers, and it's complicated, but it's not something that we can run away from. And I think that that's something that middle school educators have to think about, and educators at every kind of level. To this question of teacher training, I think a start is that, we need to, a lot of work in our, individual communities, but also at a national level, a lot of work needs to be done to rethink how we understand the role of teachers in our society, right? I think there's been an increased deprofessionalization of educators in general, and that is especially the case for educators of color, particularly Black teachers, who feel particularly alienated when it comes to the profession. But we have to think differently about the role that educators are supposed to play in society, and that has implications for how we attempt to train and develop teachers. Are we expecting for teachers to just be practitioners in a very procedural sense, that they're given instructions about the content area that they're teaching and they're supposed to go and teach that and that's it? Or are teachers expected to actually be intellectuals as well? Because if that is the case, then it requires engaging teachers in their development in this very important history and important conceptual questions that come with grappling with the legacy of Black teachers in teacher training programs. Very few teacher training programs engage teachers in learning about the history of Black teachers or any teaching, to be quite honest. And so teachers are not allowed to think about their profession as situated in a long history and in a long tradition. And they're not encouraged to think about what it means to intentionally draw on a specific pedagogical tradition and allow that to inform how they show up in the classroom and how they construct their professional identity in very intentional ways, right? One of the things that I've consistently learned when I've gone and done kind of professional development seminars, whether it's in California, in Boston, in Georgia, is a number of teachers learning about saying things like, I've never heard about this kind of expansive, sophisticated world of Black teacher associations and this rich intellectual tradition that Black teachers were engaging in, right? I never had an opportunity to reflect on that and to think about myself and my work as an extension of that. And I think that that's a failure of teacher training programs, because so much of the way we train teachers is about training them to be practitioners, not to be scholars of the practice, right? We do very little to cultivate the intellectual capacity of educators to lean into that part of the vocation. And I think that has to do, that demands a cultural shift around how we think and how we understand the role teachers have to play in any vision of justice that we have for society.
And it's interesting that you in there that really, I think, dovetails with the question that Dr. Kalasia Oj, who teaches race and education within our Department of Pan-African Studies, is asking here towards the bottom, in which, if you get into the questions, she talks about, can you reaffirm the importance of the legacy of Black teaching and knowledge production? I ask this considering the epistemological efforts of scholars like Carter G. Woodson, but also the epistemological efforts of Black teachers as scholar activists and change agents, right? And so it's about the legacy of Black teaching and or as knowledge production. So thinking of their intellectual capacity as teachers. And so she's asking for some reaffirmation of that tradition. But that for me, if I might map on also to her question, towards the end of the book, you talk about the essential role of the partnership between Black studies professors at the university level, right, and Black teachers in the K through 12 level. And so when you talk about knowledge production, when you talk about teachers thinking of themselves as intellectuals, you might also talk perhaps about that potential collaborative relationship between those of us who do Black studies in the university and those who are educators in K through 12.
Right. So I hear that question about an invitation to kind of talk more about the pedagogical practice of Black teachers as an act of knowledge production, but also this question about what it means to think across the artificial boundaries between educators and professors in Black studies and in higher education and K through 12 teachers, and that current divide that exists. That I think the history of Black teachers is very instructive for us to kind of think beyond that. But I also want to thank the folks in the chat who helped me remember the name of, yes, Joseph Cotter is the name of the person that I was trying to, I have the image in my mind. I was trying to remember the caption on it, but it's absolutely Joseph Cotter, who is a poet and also led these kind of community educational initiatives that were highlighted, from Louisville, but that were highlighted in one of these circulars for Negro History Week that I remember from the 1930s. So to this question about the kind of intellectual production of Black teachers, that's something that I've been really, really fascinated about, which is, I wanted to write the book in a way that emphasized the deep intellectual work that these teachers were engaging in, right? The deep intellectual work they were engaging in terms of not just thinking about what it means to incorporate Black history and culture into their classrooms, but they were also thinking deeply about real, the material circumstances of their students, right? When we think about people like the Jeans teachers who were going out into the rural areas where majority of Black folks were at and trying to think about how do you be responsive to the needs of these students, accounting both for their material conditions, but also for, and the material conditions that are structured by race, but also the kind of physical environment that they have around them, right? And we see, so we see those sort of things, but also, and this is why I'm doing this work with the Black Teacher Archive, because these publications that we have from Black teachers, where they're publishing from, the 1920s primarily up until 1970, is we see, these teachers writing articles about things that they're doing to address certain kind of curricular needs that they have in the classroom. We see them writing essays and commentary about political issues that are happening in the world around them, right? In terms of court cases that will have direct implications for Black teachers and also Black students. We see them, writing book reviews of things like W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction the year after it's released and publishing it in their magazines that they're circulating among teachers, right? So that legacy of Black teachers is one that we really have to elevate. And it gets to this point that you raised about the partnership between scholars in higher education and in the K through 12 setting. One of the things that I really like about these kind of colored teacher associations is that we see this constant interaction of these kind of elite Black scholars that we would think of and Black teachers, right? We get these images of W.E.B. Du Bois in New Orleans talking to a group of Black teachers and students in a gymnasium in New Orleans that's packed, right? With him talking about this book that he's working on that will come out the following year as Black Reconstruction, and the Black teachers then taking up that information and talking about how they're going to infuse their curriculum with that going forward, right? And then creating a float around the theme of Reconstruction in Louisiana for Mardi Gras the following year, and then writing a review about it. So we can literally trace the circulation of these ideas because we see these teachers seeking out information to inform their intellectual development, right? And we don't have these kind of prosthetic boundaries that we see today, where we have this very intense division between scholars and professors in higher education and educators and scholars who are doing important intellectual work in the context of K through 12 schools, right? Color teacher associations, we see these folks interacting in very important ways, right? Mary McLeod Bethune being the president of the National Association of Colored Teachers Schools when she's the president of a historically Black college, right? I can think about in Alabama, H. Council Trenholm, who was the president of Alabama State, being the president of the National Black Teachers Association for a number of years, right? So we see this kind of ongoing exchange between Black scholars in higher education and K through 12 teachers. And I think that it's an invitation for us to think about trying to model that kind of intellectual exchange and partnership in the current moment. And I think Black Studies is very well positioned to lean into that work and to model that kind of work.
So, what's interesting, I mean, we talk about what we're modeling here, and we're both in Black Studies and amongst K through 12 teachers. And I often talk, the beauty of coming into the classroom in a Black Studies space, right? Where, in my context, at least, there'll be at least 60 or 70% Black students in that classroom, and which is such a rare occurrence, and the difference in the energy that takes place, and right, what's cultivated in that classroom, what we're able to model. And I say that just to foreground this quote in the article that you wrote on the long roots of anti-racist teaching, and I was reading over it again today, and I had to stop like I was in church and pause and say, that's good, right? So let me read this back to you and just ask you to just elaborate on this a little bit more. You say, while the combative posture of anti-racism was important, Black teachers insisted that students also deserved tenderness and space to encounter and create beauty. This, too, was a refusal of anti-Blackness. Resisting white supremacy was essential, but Black pedagogy and classrooms were also sites for gathering and refuge, realms for teachers and students to model what it means to be in right relationship with one another, opportunities to try on new ways of being in this earthly place, and respite from the exhaustive white gaze, at least for a little while. This was essential to pursuing the new world they could build together. Now, of course, this was in the context of, right, Jim Crow, segregated classrooms and the like, but we're able to recapture some of that in the Black Studies classroom. But I wonder, how does that remain relevant? That type of pedagogy within the context of teaching that we could possibly do today, especially for a lot of these teachers who are here from Central and Du Bois and Grace James.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you. I think sometimes I need that reminder as well, because, and to be honest, I put that part in there because I know what is meant by the language of anti-racist teaching and anti-racist education. But to be honest, even as I wrote that essay, The Longer Roots, right, what anti-racism is does not fully capture what Black teachers were doing, because Black teachers were always aware that they had to engage in more than just the work of negation. It wasn't just the negative project. It couldn't just be about responding to external influences, right, and external hostilities. And so this idea of anything, right, is a way of framing a pedagogical orientation that is fundamentally about what it is not and what it is pushing against, as opposed to a more expansive pedagogical vision that has to do with being vigilant and responding to these external hostilities, but also aiming for something that transcends that, right? So these teachers were very clear that they had to respond to these external influences, but there was a positive project to what it was that they were doing as well, right? Don't just say what it is, the injustice that you're fighting against, but you also have to have clarity about the justice that you're trying to push into the world and that you're trying to model for students. One of a kind of a clear example of this, what I mean is that these educators are doing things to train students for, to help students think about a world that doesn't exist. When we think about the way these teachers are emphasizing civics education at a time when the majority of them and their parents did not have access to engage in civic participation, right? But by teaching voting, teaching civics, it was teaching these students to kind of have the kind of resources to then demand a world in which they were able to kind of express their kind of civic visions of justice and of the world more freely, right? It couldn't just be about saying what they're not and what they're negating, but it also had to be about what they were trying to model in the world. And I think that any liberatory vision of, or any emancipatory vision of education has to be defined and has to be clear about those things, just as they have to emphasize and name what it is that they have to refuse, right? But it can't only be about what the anti is, right? It has to also be a positive project that's very clear and not just one rooted in negation. And I think these teachers model that. They clearly were aware of the hostility surrounding them, but their teaching was not only about that. When we read from these students and they talk about the beautiful things that their teachers did with them and how their teachers modeled kind of love and care, between them and this kind of shared project of education that wasn't just about individual success, right? It wasn't just about an individual student's social mobility, but these teachers and students were modeling a way of thinking about education that has to do with collective striving, right? And I think that that's something that's very important to lift up. It wasn't just about responding to these external influences. It also had to do with developing a capacity for students to see themselves in ways that the world around them didn't have the capacity to see them or refused to see them, right? And so I appreciate you for lifting that up, but that's what I mean by that. And I think that we have to remind ourselves about that in the current moment, right? Is that the work of challenging anti-Blackness is not just about teaching Black students to develop a critique to kind of like respond to the outside world. It also has to do with deep internal work as well. And we have to keep that in front of us, especially when we think about the developmental needs of children, right? Especially when we think about the developmental needs of kids. Yeah.
And that's why, and again, because I tried to wait, I tried to wait until the last, 10 minutes to get my questions in, but you're taking us there, right? Because you're talking about this, not just the negative work, but also this kind of positive project, but that is part of what you call here collective strivings. And then earlier you took it up within Du Bois's notion of spiritual strivings, right? As a professor of religion, that hits me, right? The educational longings of Black folks is part of this kind of also religious quest. But, and here I mean religious very expansively and or spiritually very expansively, but also in that article, you talk about teachers engaging in acts of daily devotion. And by that, right, we're not talking about something in terms of religious proper, but you're talking about the ways in which Black teachers were engaging in a process of really affirmations through poetry, through engaging the work of the Harlem Renaissance and Langston Hughes and these poems and having them to recite these kinds of things that would talk about Black beauty and Black dignity and Black humanity in ways that were just kind of ritualized practices that would, as you say, awaken the body and mind for learning, and have students being devoted to the process of learning about Black people, right, in the positive sense, that was so powerful that you talk about too.
Yeah, absolutely. All that stuff is important. And we have so many accounts from students of, whose narratives I rely on to talk about that. Someone like, Bell Hooks, who we just recently lost, from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, writing about the kinds of things that her Black teachers at the Booker T. Washington School modeled for her. And she said it was that place where she learned that education could be a means for liberation, that education was supposed to be modeling the kind of liberation and the justice you're supposed to be working towards in the world. She didn't learn that from Stanford or the integrated white high school that she would go to. She makes that very clear in Teaching to Transgress, right? A scholar like Hortense Spillers, also a very important kind of Black study scholar, also writes about her grounding in Black education and learning poems, right? And even learning kind of like scriptures and the way that student performance of these things and the way that they took the King James version, the King James Bible and scripture excerpts, and the way their performative and Black phonetics developed, and how it shaped the kind of set of rhetorical practices that we see expressed beautifully in the civil rights movement and all the speeches and speakers that we love to celebrate. And she's like, that was modeled in the kind of formal training of Black students in the educational world that she grew up in Orange Mound, Tennessee, right? So many scholars write about the Sonia Sanchez, same thing. She talks about that before she leaves Birmingham to go to New York. She said, every day we sang Lift Every Voice and Sing. Then I got to the North End, didn't hear any Black poetry. And she was confused by this, right? But those things planted important seeds in her mind as an artist, as a creative thinker, but also as a champion for justice, right? And it's important for us to not lose sight of that.
Yeah, so I mean, and we're at the end, but you all go buy the book. It's amazing, it's fascinating. But as we're on that train break, you have that section where you're talking about how, and we're on that kind of spiritual striving piece and devotions and all this kind of thing, but how these teachers created that space within their classroom, right? I mean, that you would have these figures as almost icons on the wall, that the Black classroom as a kind of sacred space to enter into, right? To engage in these kinds of devotional practice and affirmations, right, of Blackness, like in the midst of an anti-Black world. Right, and the pageantry, and the coming in and dressing up as figures, and the kind of liturgical performance, if you will, right? If I can stay within my religious studies lane, right? All of that really, really is fascinating to me, and the work and the serious, important work of Black teachers that has been done in the tradition of Carter G. Woodson, in the tradition of education as part of the long Black freedom struggle. So we really, really appreciate everything that you've brought to us. We're at 5:59. I want you all to join me in giving a virtual hand clap to Dr. Givens. Thank you so much for your work, for sharing with us, for all that you've provided. And we hope that these kind of conversations will continue in your classrooms, in your respective spaces, because it's important work. Is there any last word that you might want to give us, Dr. Givens, before we part ways?
I just want to say thank you, and I really appreciate the very rich questions and the range of the questions as well. A lot of the questions kind of allowing us to linger in the historical context and think with these people and their experiences. A lot of folks will hear the narrative and will only want to talk about the contemporary, but I appreciate the opportunity to sit and to pull apart these important aspects of the story and to allow it to kind of like wash over us. I think is very important. To do that work, especially during Black History Month. This kind of immersive, this kind of immersive approach to thinking about these ideas and this history is very important. I appreciate the engagement. I appreciate the invitation, Professor McCormick. And yeah, I'm looking forward to more conversations in the future.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Here's the book. Find your way to your nearest bookstore and get this book. All right. Thank you all for being here. Thank you from the Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice Research. We appreciate your presence, and we look forward to being in further conversation and dialogue with you soon. Thank you, Dr. Givens. Thank you all. Good night.
Have a good one.